10 minutes of remarks, and after that we will open it up for discussion. You have been very patiently hearing all these wonderful speakers, and after that at 5 o'clock in half an hour time, we will have a reception outside with a lot of interaction among you, the speakers. So bear with us, and David Cash. It's interesting that we started with Bill Clark, and there's a connection between Bill Clark and the last speaker. First of all, David Cash is our new Dean of Graduate School, McCormack Graduate School of Public Policy. We have all these very long names, but I think that's right.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, right. Okay. And David Cash also happens to be a former associate, a student of Bill Clark. So we started with Bill Clark, and we are going to end with David Cash, complete the circle, and then we will have questions from you.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be addressing these issues, which in an academic setting I have not done in about 10 years, and because I've come from state government. But I also want to acknowledge, do you realize what just happened to you? You just got an infusion of information about perhaps one of the most dynamic fields in research about issues that are so incredibly pressing. And this is not to say, and I will be completely fair with the rest of the school that I'm a dean of, which has a very robust gerontology department problem. So I hope you realize how special that is. And Kamal and Reimar, thank you so much for setting this discussion up today. And just for some of the evidence of the importance, I would argue that if an agreement comes out of Paris, and I'm pretty hopeful that an agreement will, and even if on the large scale an agreement isn't reached in a way that satisfies everyone, certainly the decisions that are being made today with the cities, with mayors and regions, is a huge step there. And I would submit that those kinds of advances have not been, we would not be there yet if not for this kind of science. Because I think this kind of science has underpinned some of the work that's gone on at the IPCC in a pretty fundamental way. In fact, if you think about the institution of the IPCC, which is not just scientists from all over the world working as one big group, but it's scientists that are nominated and put forward by each of the countries who are then going to negotiate this framework. So there's a link between decision makers and science within the whole IPCC rubric, some of which has been very controversial, some of which is not. The links aren't strong enough, some of which the links show politicization of the scientific process, however you interpret that. But there's been that kind of link, which I think is a hallmark of this kind of work. And I think that you can see spots throughout the world, that's been demonstrated here, where the whole notion of the dynamics that Bill and Karen and Jack put on the table have helped with decision making. And Bill, Muma, I will tell, and I know you know this because you've been involved in Massachusetts, but there is one jurisdiction in the world in which biomass energy does not get the same credits as wind and solar and other renewables, and that's in Massachusetts. And that's because, we took essentially, you're welcome. It's a very funny story about that. We knew that we had a problem because our own internally people were thinking, this can't be right. You burn a piece of wood, but it takes 50 years for the tree to grow up. And at the same time, there were forest advocates from the western part of the state that were complaining about what was going on and demonstrating. And I went out to Springfield to describe all the wonderful things that our agency was doing to address climate change. And I walked up to the Springfield Library, and I had been warned that this could happen because like a staff member called me on my cell phone as I'm getting into Springfield and said, you may want to go to the back entrance because... But I come through the front entrance, and there's this guy wearing a 6-foot-tall asthma inhaler costume and screaming at me on how I'm killing children in that area by promoting biomass, which at that time we were. So that was one of the joys of state government. There were many, but that was one of them. Anyway, it was the link between the decision makers in the state And we eventually hired a reputable organization, the Manamet Conservation Organization, to do our study. And we scoped out the whole study. We asked them the kinds of analytical questions that we wanted answers to. And some of them was about life cycle of the biomass, where it came from, the difference between waste wood and not waste wood, and this whole budget, the CO2 budget that would come from burning before trees could come back, and then sent them off. Very thoughtfully considered how much we should be involved in scoping and how much we shouldn't, how much we should be involved in vetting their report or not, how we were going to communicate the findings of the report, all of those kinds of things, and get the answers that we needed to then put into regulations, which we did and wasn't easy, and politically it was difficult too, because there's a large forestry contingent in this state as well. But that, I would offer that as an example of it working, but there are many, many, many. And if you just go to Kamal's organization in India, you will see it on the ground where scientists and communities are working hand in hand. But that brings me to my question to the four of you. And I will say that I didn't hear much about the role of the decision maker. And in fact, let me ask, how many decision makers are in the room here? You work in state government, county government, city government. NGOs, decision maker NGOs. Business, okay, we have one. Okay, so I would say that as an organization that's looking at sustainable science, I haven't seen that look from Bill Clark at me in so long. I don't know if it's comforting or it's like it's raising all the trauma with him. But I would submit, if we are talking about sustainability science as a discipline, as an effort moving forward in which scientists engage with how decisions are being made, we're not going to get very far if this is a room filled with academics and not a room filled with academics and decision makers, etc. But what I would love to hear from the four of you is how, either in the specifics that you're working on or more globally in your framework, what is the role that decision makers play, should play, ideally play? What happens when they don't play? What's the role in the framework of sustainability science and decision? And maybe your answer is shouldn't, and here's why. But I'd love to hear some of that.
Anyway, when I made the shift from doing chemistry to doing policy science, I guess, people referred to me as, well, Bill Memoir's a scientist, but he's a very political scientist. And I've never been in a political science department, so you get the connotation there. But I've always felt an obligation to take the knowledge that I've been able to gain and to use it in some constructive way, whether that was with the Congress or with the state of Massachusetts on the biomass issue, which is not always easy. I mean, people in those positions, I did not wear a 6 foot. I was not the one in the 6 foot high.
I was wondering.
No, it wasn't me. No, instead we went to the offices in Boston and met with people in a very civilized way and laid things out for them, and they were reasonable people, and they were being pressed on the other side because the forest industry just thinks, well, if we just chop up more and sell more, that's all that matters, and. Not everybody in the state felt that way, and it did not support the science. The science didn't support that. So Massachusetts is the only state that has a plan which doesn't just give it all away and set some restrictions on it. The problem is that both science and economic interests and ideology all play a role. And one of the shocks for me when I went to work for the Congress was that science was just an advisory thing, no matter what the facts were, if there were other interests that were stronger, then the duly elected legislators would vote to. I mean, they almost voted to bring down the ozone layer, right? Yeah, that was a really interesting issue for me to discover that hey, in my district there's a big CFC manufacturing plant. I can't do this. So those are the realities. So on the other hand, without the information, we would make a lot more really bad decisions. So you can't expect it to be the advice to be taken every time, and scientists, I don't think, should be ruling the world in any sense. But there should be a place for sustainability science to enter the process, and hopefully there are receptive people on the other side. Unfortunately, in the national government right now, and the Congress and everything, it appears there's a whole lot of people who don't want to do that. That's a challenge. I don't know how to deal with that.
So Bill Clark, how does the sustainability science enter the process, the policy process? Or answer what you were writing. It's a different.
Okay, so some troubling answers. I think the biggest failure of a funded program I ever ran was one shortly after I'd worked with the National Academy of Sciences, getting one of this country's first sort of reports on what do we know as scientists about sustainable development. So we'd gotten that done. And some perverse person said, so what about the decision makers? Where are they all? And, so we said, right, got it. So untypically for an academy report, the last line was not, and more study is needed,
Yes.
Or we should have a new committee to do the same thing over again. Rather it was, kill off this committee, just put it to bed. And we should all go out and build for working with the decision makers on these issues. That is, the table should be not just a bunch of scientists around it, but a bunch of scientists and NGO leaders and corporate leaders and so on. And we did that. Packard Foundation funded us, bless them, before Fiorina. But it's contagious. Total collapse. Why was it a collapse? It was because the decision makers were very interested in sustainability. They were doing stuff on sustainability. They had no interest at all in sitting down with us around the kind of general frameworks we were talking about here.
Right.
They were ecstatic at going at, what can you tell me, or even how can I work with you on what we do about dams being put on the upper reaches of the Mekong and what that's going to do to downstream fisheries and what could we do about it. Or on how we should be thinking about development of chemicals at DuPont in ways that we don't get caught in another thing like the CFCs.
Yep.
But for the general stuff, one meeting and they were out of there.
Yeah.
And that was not the style in which we academics had been working. So total catastrophe. I've never had a grant before or since, I think, that I've had to write back to the sponsors and say, we blew it. The whole hypothesis behind this was not just not quite right, it was wrong. So, you know, if we hadn't spent all your money, you could take it back. Maybe that's why Packard went broke. What we determined, so we did a second round on that, and the result was, still within my little bundled world here, the academies went and set up a thing called the Roundtable on Science and Technology for Sustainability. And that has had its ups and downs, but what it did was say, not as a long-term engagement, but as a 2 meetings a year, pick the right cross-section of corporate, NGO, government leaders, and a cross-section of the academics in this business, and sit them down for 2 days each, twice a year, of really intensely well-prepped notions of what's on your mind, what kind of knowledge do you guys out there on the front lines, the agitators, need? What's the state of the science from like zero, as in informing urbanization as a big process, to, oh, we know a lot about that, I'm glad you asked. And we didn't try to get it done at the table, but we opened up those lines of communication. And that's worked pretty well. So, where I come out as, David, what I was looking at you is, as you know well, doing boundary work, which he wrote his thesis on. Sustainability scientists standing in that pastures quadrant, spending the morning not trying to bring all your academic colleagues out into the factory or all the factory guys out to spend a sabbatical with you at the university, but shifting back and forth, moving the conversation, doing the occasional couplings. that's how you get it in, and I take it that was not the event we were asked to come to.
All right.
Karen, what do you think?
Well, David, you're not the only one with your PhD advisor in the room, because I looked up at my PhD advisor.
It's dangerous.
It is dangerous. Well, I'm reminded of the first time I went in the field with Curtis in China. And we interviewed, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember this. We interviewed a bunch of people on the ground, and also to understand why cities were being developed in China. And at that time, so I started off my career as a remote sensing scientist. And, you know, with satellite data, you know a lot that a lot of other people don't know, right? And you can see these bird-eyed views of how cities are developing that local policymakers don't even know. But one of the things that I've found in the last 10 years or so is that increasingly they want answers to which we don't know the answer. They no longer want to know like how fast their cities are growing or whether they're like shrinking or all of that. They want to know what's the best way to develop my infrastructure to reduce congestion or something like that. And we know a lot of case studies from around the world about what works well here in North America or in Europe, but we don't have a set of principles, like generalizable principles, where we can say under these contexts, and I think this is where the science comes in, to say under these contexts and these conditions, these are the pathways that will be less harmful than others. I have to say though, as a researcher interacting with decision makers, it's been a very challenging, like talk about totally, you know, body out of context, whatever that, body out of body experience, right? Yeah. And most recently with the urban SDG, you know, so someone was mentioning the United Nations just passed the Sustainable Development Goals, and I was brought on early on to help develop the urban Sustainable Development Goal, and was part of a lot of those discussions, trying to insert science on what the metrics would be on sustainable urban development, what the indicators were, what the right goals would be, achievable goals. And most of the people in the room were decision makers, people from NGOs and a little bit from the private sector, but many from governments and government organizations who were basically saying, well, we can't measure that. Those are not things of interest to us. That's too long of a time horizon. What about these things that are linked to the other, like embodied energy? What do you mean? We care about what's happening in our city. And it's unfortunate because I think it's a lost opportunity, because what has happened with the urban SDG, it's a great achievement on the one hand, that there is an urban SDG. Yep. But on the other hand, if you actually look at the goals and the metrics, they fall well short of what the current state of the science is.
But my guess is you have worked with individual cities on individual projects and have managed to build pathways that got them useful, that let you draw on useful information from your scholarly world and help them apply it to particular cases.
That is so optimistic, but I will have to say I don't think so. I mean, I was just in China 3 weeks ago, right before Thanksgiving, whenever that was, where we had a big discussion about, you know, China's urbanization plan. And some of that is very science-based, but certainly not sustainability science-based. So I think, you know, there's a lot of dialogue and discussion and banquets where we talk about what we know, right? You know those, but then they just do whatever they want, right? I mean, they as in the decision makers. It's no different than here, right?
Jack, what's your angle on this?
Right, yeah. Actually, as a scientist, my first interaction with decision makers was we create some results, and which made headlines, and the decision makers trying to not allow me to do research there anymore. Okay,
That's a danger.
yeah. So just back to this first example that I presented. So you see this panda habitat was declining over time. And in 2001, we published a paper in Science and reporting that the habitat within the nature reserve was getting worse after the reserve was established. Also, the habitat inside the reserve was worse than outside of the reserve. Okay, so the government did not like it. So that's not possible. So they said, we spend so much time, money on panda conservation. You are saying something that really does not make any sense. So your results must not be right. So they said, well, you cannot do research there here anymore. So for almost a year, we are not allowed to do research there. Then they did a lot of investigation, and finally they found that our results were accurate. That at that point, that was a turning point. Then they say, okay, you find problems. We like you to help us find solutions to the problem. So they did a couple things. One is that the former director of the nature reserve was asked to retire early, and one co-author of our paper became the new director of the reserve. Okay, so the new director implement some policies, and then since then, the habitat has been recovered. So the diagram I showed there. So not only that for that reserve, but my collaborator in the Chinese Academy has been asked by the Chinese government policymakers to draft plans for the nationwide panda conservation. So I was asked to be advisor to the effort to draft the policy document. Actually, my collaborator actually was drafting the policy document for the agency. Okay? So I think the relationship has become from negative to positive, because in the beginning, even the president of China knew about our study. And then the governors of the province was very, unhappy about it. And then, so that I think now the relationship become such that they trust us, and then, ask us to provide suggestions. And then I think that's a good way to interact with the policymakers.
Great. So we're only going to have time for a couple of questions, but I wanted to take the opportunity and advantage of my places to make one comment on what everyone said, and then turn it over to you for questions. And that is, there's so many things that sustainability science has done in breaking down kind of traditional stovepipes, barriers, whatever you want to call them. I mean, we've heard today the importance of intra and intergenerational thinking. We've heard about the interconnectivity and the telecoupling. We've heard about the importance for transdisciplinarity. I would argue that what we've just been talking about, the linking to the decision makers, however you think about it, you need another slide on that. Because I think that's it's a fundamentally different part of how this science works compared to other kinds of sciences. And we all know that there are examples of those. I think it's all somewhat in the back of our heads of how this works. But I think it should be a kind of framed and structured part of this. And before Bill can say anything responding to me, I'll open up to questions.
Elephant
A related question is, so we can model the biogeochemistry.
Can you just quickly introduce yourself?
I'm Bob Chen at the School for Environment. We can model the biogeochemistry, we can model the economics, we can model some of the social sciences, but a critical linchpin is the decision maker. And do we have a prayer at understanding the psychology and the social behavior to be able to model the decision makers?
Yeah, we are trying to.
Or is it random? None of us is random.
No.
And then
Sure.
what do we do how do we behave so that we can influence this?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. I think it's very important. That's how, for the second example I gave, actually we have a lot of social scientists in the team, anthropologists, the sociologists, economists, and so on and so forth, trying to understand people's behavior and develop a kind of an integrated model, not just the biophysical side, but also socioeconomic side, the behavior side. In 2001, I edited a special issue on how to integrate ecology with socioeconomics and behavior, and trying to put all the relevant information into a model, a systems model, such as an agent-based model. We can simulate the behavior of different agents, like we can treat decision makers and consumers and producers as different types of agents.
Ma'am?
Oh, we all have to
No,
answer?
no, just if you want. No, Clark, I thought I
You know, I was going to say, I don't think we're anywhere close to modeling the process. You know, I just came off of a meeting on urban sustainability for the National Academy, and we said, you know, we know so many things about urban sustainability, but the big thing we don't know is about the process of decision making. So I think before we can start modeling and identifying what the potential parameters are, we have to have a better understanding of the process. And I think we're pretty far away from that, partly because we've been focused on the stocks, which are much easier to monitor and to study and model than those linkages that I was showing. That's the hard stuff.
If the question is, can I predict what any given decision maker will do? Maybe not so well. But for heaven's sake, the business world would not invest as much as it does in advertising if they didn't think they had a way of first modeling, that is, what will influence people to buy my product, and then implementing those models to get them to buy the product. So they know how to do that. We've taken basically pages from their playbook when we've tried to do things like reduce smoking, reduce other antisocial behaviors. So we know how en masse to bias the set of a population's decisions in certain directions. And people do immense amounts of research, again, mostly in marketing departments. We have good foundations in game theory when what you want to do is think systematically about what two different people or groups, small numbers of groups, who will react strategically to one another. Behavioral economics is probably the fastest growing intellectual area in policy science right now, because they finally discovered randomized controlled trials. R.A. Fisher lives. That's another story. But the point is, they are finally saying, well, gee, we think this will cause people to change their behaviors this way. That's decision making. But radically, we don't know. Why don't we try it out? So I think this is a highly active area, and yeah, we can model them. And Jack's right. The surge in use of agent-based models, which focus on the decision makers and the flow of information that is available to them, rather than a sort of generic field effects model like a supply-demand model or our general simulation models, that's a sign that we're at least making progress in those areas. Now, I wish your agent-based models were a little better,
Yeah.
but you know.
Right.
Should political capital be in your capital stocks function?
It's certainly in social capital. It's a piece of social capital, I think, but it could be pulled out, probably.
Well, it is. The problem is
Yeah.
that to the extent that we have measures of it, and it's at national levels, measures of trust in governance and so on, it's tanking.
Well, yeah.
Just
Absolutely.
tanking.
Michael Pulaski, I'm New England Aquarium and School for the Environment. And this actually kind of goes back to what you were talking about, and when you talked about how come sustainable development goals always fall short. And I think part of it is where it's sustainability science, but yet we talk about sustainable goals, and we're taking a process of continual improvement, and we're having a decorative land equation. So I work a lot in fisheries aquaculture, and so sustainable fisheries stocks are consistent, and they're consistent over time. But yet, if you look at food provisioning on a per capita basis, global population is going up, so per capita availability is actually decreasing, which is not a sustainable state. But yet, so we're taking very short term, we've reached the point, and part of it is nobody wants to be unsustainable, so they always look for ways to say, how are we sustainable? As opposed to, this is the goal we've reached now, and then our forward-looking goal is going to be this. And the process of achieving greater sustainability, I think, gets lost at some of these policy level.
Could I just comment on that? I did a report for the Dutch government a year and a half ago, and I looked into this very carefully. We analyzed all the fisheries treaties in the world. There's 65 of them, basically, as we could find. And only 13 of them even had a scientific body. Of those, only 6 had enforcement mechanisms. Most fisheries treaties simply come out with a number and say, go do it. So we actually overfish legally in the vast majority of the regional fishing organizations. So then we allow very destructive practices, bottom trawling, all those kinds of things. There are other destructive practices that occur. We then eliminate half of the coastal wetlands of the world and dam most of the rivers, and then pollute all of the estuaries, which is basically the nurseries. So the productivity of fish goes down. We cut off the supply and we increase the take, and then we wonder why we have been for almost 30 years now at the level of wild catch we have, and down slightly from the peak from 25 years ago. So it's basically like the situation of declaring biomass emissions as zero. We declare that we have a sustainable fishery by definition. And we don't have a sustainable fishery. And fishermen get some of the blame, and there are some really bad actors out there, but a lot of fishermen are playing by the rules. But the productivity of the ocean is going down. And that's never taken into account even when we set the goals by scientific bodies of the fisheries treaties. So there are a lot of factors where we're not using the science well. I think that's really one of the things. And second, we're not always doing it well. Secondly, when we do it well, it's still not utilized by the decision makers. So it's how do we deal with that step? How do we move from getting the information out to having it actually act? Because, case after case, 10,000 tons. Okay, let's make it. The fishermen want 30. Okay, let's do 20. That's kind of the way things go. So I don't know how to change that, to show that it's really in the interest of everyone. To maybe even 10 is too much. Maybe it should only be 5. I don't know. But we really do need to build in a margin of error. Maximum sustained yield is a death sentence for most
So
groups.
they've been trying to move to ecosystem-based models, but maybe it's a broader telecoupling fisheries model.
Yeah.
Actually, now there are some people, including a former president of American Fisheries Society. He is very interested in applying the telecarbon framework to address global fisheries sustainability issues.
Yeah. Well, we need better analytical tools.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I think I agree with you actually fundamentally with what you're saying, that people want to feel like they're making progress. And this NRC committee on urban sustainability, we have a practitioner on the committee, and it's fascinating as we're going around the country to different cities to study their urban sustainability strategies, that the practitioner reminds us that we need to frame things in a way that would be digestible, let's say, because people want to be optimistic.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
they want to be optimistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we also need to frame things with enough
Realistic.
internal coherence and scientific rigor that even as we go into such a negotiation to try to get something actually adopted and used, we have some protection against fooling ourselves, a la the biofuel fiasco. Just saying, well, this has some good elements to it, so why don't we? No. The fact is that right now, for very few fisheries in the world, do we in fact have an internally coherent model that says, is this fishery being managed
No.
in a way to generate, to the best of our knowledge, a continual flow of well-being to people, the fishers, the fishery, and so forth, indefinitely through time? And that would include not decimating the stock, but it would have interesting notions about whether we should be doing a lot of people doing a little fishing or a few people doing some big factory fishing and so on. But we don't have coherent treaty frameworks or negotiating frameworks that are centered on sustainability notions, that is, sustainable well-being of people working off this resource base. We've got them screwed up in old fisheries models of sustainable means the fish is still there, as though there were no human world impinging on it, except as a little control variable. So Mostly the fault is ours.
Yeah.
In the academic community, we don't have our own heads screwed on particularly well. And so when we do make these overtures into the policy world, we're as likely to compromise away truth as we are to compromise some hard political deals because we don't know what we're talking about.
But I think there's also an inherent tension between the outcome that we would like, whether it's lower emissions or sustainable fisheries, and the process to achieve those outcomes, right? And so there's a lot of different efforts at multiple scales towards, Paris, urban sustainability, all of that. And at what point do you say, you're spending all this money, but we're actually not getting anywhere near the outcome that we want? And in fact, as in your case, the outcome is even worse than in other places.
That's right. Yes.
Right? And I think it's partly that you don't want to completely throw water on the fire of enthusiasm.
Right.
But but where's that fine line of saying, actually, this is not making the kind of progress that we really need?
Well, I think I heard a reference to the concept of optimism just a few minutes ago, and so on that optimistic note, I could grab that out of the air, declare victory. But this is an ongoing process and dialogue, and so tune in next semester because we have another Dimensions of Sustainability Symposium. And thank you very much for our esteemed and wonderful speakers, and it was really great. And save up your questions for next semester.